The corridor stretched endlessly in both directions. A tunnel of pale walls and humming fluorescent lights that seemed to swallow every trace of warmth. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant, sharp and clinical, as though it had been scrubbed clean of comfort along with the germs. Every sound carried heels clicking, carts rattling, the soft crackle of an intercom, and then dissolved in the silence again, leaving the space feeling hollow, like the echo of a place where no one truly wanted to linger. Two little girls stood in the middle of that sterile emptiness, small shadows lost in a world too large for them. Lily and Sophie clutched their teddy bears tightly to their chests. Their arms wound around the worn fabric, as though the stuffed animals could protect them from the weight pressing down on their young shoulders. Lily's bear was white. Its stitched smile faded from years of holding on through nights of fear and mornings of comfort. Sophie's was pink, its fur damp from the tears that had soaked into it. The girls' matching blonde hair framed their pale faces, and their dresses soft shades of pink, chosen once for joy, now looked out of place in this house of sorrow. Their eyes, wide and blue, darted toward every doctor and nurse who hurried past. Each time footsteps neared, a small flicker of hope lit in their gazes, only to dim again when no one stopped. The adults around them never paused. Charts were checked, medicines delivered, conversations muttered in low urgency, but the children remained unseen, like forgotten ornaments against the wall. Hours stretched, one bleeding into the next, and though the girls whispered to each other now and then, silence soon returned. Heavy and suffocating, Sophie reached for her sister's hand, her small fingers trembling as she slipped them into Lily's palm. They pressed together, shoulder to shoulder, as though their closeness could form a shield against the loneliness that threatened to swallow them whole. They tried to be brave, whispering reassurances they barely believed, but every so often the dam inside them broke, and soft sobs escaped their lips, filling the corridor with a grief too fragile for the rushing world to notice. The silence that followed was broken not by compassion, but by the sound of shoes, polished leather, striking the tile in a rhythm to steady, to deliberate to belong to a nurse in haste. The sound grew louder, drawing nearer, and it seemed to change the very air around them. The girls lifted their tear-streaked faces, eyes wide, watching as a man came into view. He did not belong to the hospital's chaos. His suit was a pale blue, immaculate and precise, his dark hair styled with the care of someone accustomed to perfection. He walked with authority, a presence that seemed to command space without trying. This was Richard Morgan, though here, stripped of his entourage and headlines, he was only a man moving through a place that smelled of endings. His gaze swept the corridor, sharp and practiced, and then it caught on them. Two small figures, clinging to teddy bears, faces wet with tears no one else had noticed. He slowed, his footsteps faltering with an unfamiliar hesitation. For years, he had walked into boardrooms, across stages, through offices filled with expectation, and never once had he stumbled. Yet here, confronted with two little girls and their quiet despair, his stride broke. Something flickered across his face, something he did not let the world see. He stood still, watching them, as if torn between stepping forward and turning away. The girls stared back, their fear laced with a fragile hope, as though they could not decide if the stranger in the immaculate suit was safe or dangerous. Richard Morgan, who had built an empire brick by disciplined brick, felt something shift inside him. It was a crack, small but undeniable, in the walls he had so carefully constructed. He adjusted the cuff of his jacket, took in a slow breath, and reminded himself that he was a man who thrived on decisions. And yet this sight of two children crying alone in a corridor felt like the hardest choice he had faced in years. The hum of the lights, the rush of footsteps, the distant beeping of machines all faded into the background. Only the girls remained, and the steady thud of his own heart as he took a step closer. Then another. The air thickened with something unspoken, as if the whole corridor held its breath. For the first time in hours, the little girls were no longer invisible. Asterisk, the man in the immaculate suit, did not walk past them. His polished shoes slowed until the echo of his steps faded into stillness. For a moment, he simply stood there, a tall figure of authority framed against the harsh white lights. His eyes, sharp and calculating in boardrooms, softened as they rested on the children. Yet a flicker of something unspoken pain, perhaps, crossed his expression. Lily blinked up at him first. Her lashes were heavy with tears, as she hugged her teddy bear tighter as though afraid he might take it away. Sophie leaned into her sister's side, her small shoulders trembling, both of them staring at the stranger who had broken through the silence. They did not know who he was or what power he carried beyond that corridor, but in their eyes, he was simply a man who had stopped when no one else had. Richard Morgan drew a slow breath. He had built a life on control, every meeting, every deal, every glance of his watch measured and precise. Yet here, faced with two trembling children, he felt something unfamiliar, hesitation. He had come to this hospital for duty, to show his face at the bedside of an employee who had given years to his company. It was supposed to be a gesture, a small ripple in a sea of obligations. But the ripple had become a wave the moment he turned a corner and saw them. "Why are you here all alone?" His voice, usually crisp and commanding, softened without his permission. The words slipped into the silence like stones dropping into still water. Rippling outward in ways he could not yet measure, the twins exchanged a glance. Lily's small lips parted, but no sound came. Her throat trembled with words too heavy for her tiny frame. Finally, in a whisper that barely carried past her bare-stitched smile, she said, "Mommy is sleeping. It won't wake up." The sentence, fragile and innocent, struck Richard harder than any accusation, harder than any defeat in the ruthless world of business. Sleeping. He knew the weight of that word in a hospital. He had heard it before. Once, long ago. He lowered himself slightly, no longer towering above them like an authority figure, but crouching so his gaze could meet theirs. Sophie clutched her pink bear so tightly his head bent forward, her blue eyes glistening. "We don't want to leave," she whispered, her voice quivering. "If we leave, maybe she'll wake up, and we won't be here." The world shifted around Richard. He saw the corridor dissolve into another memory, one he had locked away for years. Another hospital. Another set of small hands clinging to him, voices calling for comfort that he could not give. His daughter's face is gone now, swallowed by time, and tragedy overlapped with the pale, tear-streaked faces before him. For a terrifying instant, past and present blurred, and he was no longer standing in this corridor, but in the one that had shattered his life. Richard closed his eyes, forcing the memory back into its cage. He had sworn never to open those doors again, never to let grief undo him. But the girls' voices had cracked the lock with frightening ease. "Where's your family?" he asked, steadying his voice though his chest ached. "Who is here with you?" The girls looked at each other, and Lily shook her head. "Nobody. Just us. Just us." The words echoed in his mind like a curse. To little girls abandoned in a place where even hope seemed afraid to linger. Richard straightened, his jaw tightening. He told himself he had no place here, that this was not his burden to carry. He was a man of empires, not of lullabies. His world was contracts and skyscrapers, not fragile children clinging to teddy bears. Yet his body betrayed him. His feet refused to move away. His heart, long armored in steel and ambition, beat with an ache he could no longer ignore. A nurse rushed past, arms full of charts, muttering instructions under her breath. She didn't even glance at the girls. The doors down the hall swung open, releasing a fleeting gust of antiseptic air and the soft beep of machines, but no one stopped. No one even slowed. The twins remained invisible to the world except to him. Richard felt the corridor grow colder. Though the air hadn't changed, the truth pressed against him. If he walked away, they would remain alone, forgotten, perhaps forever. He exhaled slowly, a sound almost like surrender. And in that moment, he knew, whatever happened next, he was already entangled in their lives. The corridor pressed in around him, colder now. Though Richard knew it was not the air, but the memory clawing its way back into his chest. He wanted to stand, to straighten, to remind himself that he was Richard Morgan, the man who never faltered, who signed checks that banked governments, who built towers of steel high enough to kiss the clouds. But his knees refused to obey. He remained crouched, eye level with the trembling children who stared at him as though he were the last lighthouse. In a storm, he had asked them where their family was. The answer had been simple, brutal. Nobody. Just as the words gnawed at him as silence fell again. The hum of fluorescent bulbs filled the space between them, but it was not enough to drown the memory rising unbidden in his mind. Another hospital. Another set of doors with windows to hide for small children to peer through. His daughters, hair the same shade of pale gold, clutching his hands as machines hissed and monitors beeped that cruel rhythm. Their mother, his wife, pale against white sheets, her chest rising slower, slower, until it never rose again. The world had ended in that room, though the clocks kept ticking. He had left the hospital that day not as a father or a husband, but as something hollow, He buried the man he had been in work, brick by relentless brick. And when his girls were taken from him in a cruel twist of fate years later, he sealed that hollow place with iron, promised never to feel again, promised never to let grief crack him open, and yet, here he was. The little strangers had undone decades of discipline with nothing more than tears. Sophie's small voice broke through his thoughts. Are you here for Mommy too? Her tone was so tentative, as if the wrong answer would shatter what little strength she had left. Richard blinked, caught off guard. No, sweetheart, he said softly, the word slipping from his lips before he could stop it. He had not called anyone sweetheart in years. I was visiting someone else. The disappointment in her eyes was sharp, quick, but she nodded. She did not ask again. Lily spoke next, her voice steadier though her lips trembled. We can't leave her. We promised. She lifted the white bear slightly, as though it could vouch for her truth. We told her we'd stay right here, so when she wakes up, she'll see us first. Richard's throat tightened. The innocence in her words was a knife. Children clung to promises like life rafts, even when the sea was already swallowing them whole. He wanted to tell them the truth, to prepare them for the storm about to break. But he couldn't. Not yet. He wasn't ready to hear his own voice say it. Behind them, a set of doors banged open, and a gurney rushed past, wheels rattling across the tiles. The twins shrank closer together, their wide eyes following the blur of motion until it vanished. The corridor fell silent again, but the tension it left behind lingered. Richard looked around. Nurses darted in and out of rooms, voices clipped and professional, eyes fixed on tasks. No one glanced at the children. No one wondered why they were standing alone, with teddy bears clutched to their chests, invisible. That was what they were. To tiny ghosts in a place where the living and dying exchanged hands every hour. He exhaled, long and low, then pushed himself to his feet. The girls' heads tilted back, tracking his every movement as if afraid he might vanish. He almost did. His instinct screamed to walk away, to escape before the weight of their sorrow anchored him completely. But his legs betrayed him again. Instead of turning toward the exit, he turned toward them. What's your mother's name? He asked quietly. Emily, Lily answered. She said it softly, as if the name itself was fragile. A glass ornament she might drop if she spoke too loudly. Emily. The name hit him like a stone thrown against glass. For an instant, his chest ached with the memory of another Emily, his late wife, whom he had once whispered love to, in a similar place, under similar lights. Fate, it seemed, had a cruel sense of poetry. He dragged a hand across his face, steadying himself. Do you know what room she's in? The girls nodded, and Sophie pointed with her small hand toward a closed door halfway down the hall. The blinds were drawn, the glass window dark. Machines hummed faintly from within, muffled but steady. Richard's gaze lingered on that door. The door to the truth. The door to heartbreak. He had stood before doors like it too many times, and every time, something precious had been taken from him. He didn't want to step closer, and yet he couldn't look away. A nurse came bustling past, her shoes squeaking against the tiles. Richard's hand shot out before he thought, stopping her. She blinked at him, startled, then recognized the authority in his gaze, the kind of gaze that made people listen, even when they didn't want to. These girls, Richard said, his tone calm, but edged with steel. Why are they alone here? The nurse hesitated, glancing at the twins. She looked uncomfortable, as though she hadn't noticed them until now. Their mother was admitted 2 days ago. Critical condition. I think the father isn't in the picture. Her voice dropped lower. They've been waiting here ever since. Richard's jaw tightened. And no one thought to? He let the question dangle, sharp and accusing. The nurse flushed. We're understaffed. We do what we can. With that, she slipped away, leaving the air colder than before. Lily's eyes searched his face, small and desperate. Can you stay? Just for a little while? It was such a simple request. A request so small it should have cost him nothing. But to Richard, it was a demand that threatened to crack the armor he had built over decades. Staying meant remembering. Staying meant caring. And caring was a dangerous thing for a man who had already lost everything once before. His silence stretched. The girls' eyes grew wider, shimmering with unshed tears, their hope hanging by a thread. And then, finally, Richard nodded. I'll stay. The words were quiet. But in that corridor, under the humming lights and flickering bulbs, they carried the weight of a vow. Richard Morgan had lived a life of glass walls and boardrooms, where silence was power and hesitation was weakness. Yet here, in the dim corridor of a Dallas hospital. Silence carried no power, it was suffocating, pressing against him with the weight of two pairs of frightened eyes. Lily and Sophie clung to their bears, their little hands so tight on the fabric that Richard could see their knuckles whitening. They had stopped crying for the moment, but it wasn't because the tears were gone. It was the silence that came after too much crying, the silence that drained the sound out of a child's throat when grief grew too heavy. Richard had promised he would stay. He still wasn't sure why those words had left his lips. They felt foreign, almost reckless. He was a man of empires, not of children. He could measure markets and dictate futures, but he didn't know how to mend a 6-year-old's heart. Still, here he stood, trapped by his own vow, staring at the closed door behind which their mother lay. Every so often, the girls' eyes flicked toward that door, as if they expected it to open and their mother to step out smiling. They didn't understand that sometimes doors never opened. Richard did. He had lived it. He cleared his throat, uncomfortable in the way the silence wrapped around them. "Have you eaten?" he asked. Lily shook her head. Sophie pressed her face into her bear's ear and whispered something he couldn't catch. Richard looked down the hall. The vending machine buzzed faintly under the flickering light. He had never in his life bought food from such a machine. Someone else had always done those trivial things for him. Yet tonight, he found himself crossing the cold tile, pulling out his sleek wallet, and feeding the slot bills far larger than the machine was accustomed to swallowing. The clatter of packaged snacks echoed like gunfire in the quiet corridor. He gathered them awkwardly small bags of pretzels, crackers, chocolate bars and returned to the girls. "Here." He crouched again, setting the offerings down in front of them. The girls blinked at him as though he had handed them treasure. Their small fingers reached out cautiously, as if afraid he might take the food back. Sophie tore into a chocolate bar with trembling hands. Lily, more careful, peeled open a packet of crackers, then broke one in half and handed it to her sister before taking a piece for herself. That simple gesture, the instinct to share, twisted something deep in Richard's chest. He sat back against the wall, watching them. He didn't eat. He couldn't. His stomach was a knot of memory and unease. The corridor buzzed with distant noise and intercom announcement. A nurse's hurried steps sped around them. Time seemed to slow. "Asters, tell me about your mother," Richard said finally, his voice low. The twins exchanged a glance, the kind that carried volumes in silence. Then Lily spoke, her tone soft but clear. "She sings us songs at night, even when she's tired. She makes pancakes with chocolate chips on Saturdays." Her lips trembled. "She says pancakes taste better when you laugh." Sophie added quickly, "She tells us we're brave, even when we're not." Richard's throat tightened. He closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them, he forced his gaze to stay steady on theirs. "She sounds extraordinary." The girls nodded, eyes shining with a mixture of pride and despair. Before Richard could say more, the sharp beep of a monitor sounded faintly from behind the closed door. His head snapped toward it. The sound was brief, a spike of warning that quickly steadied, but it sent a ripple of fear through the corridor. The girls froze, their small bodies rigid, their eyes wide. "Asterisk, it's okay," Richard said quickly, though he wasn't sure it was true. He didn't know what was happening behind that door. He only knew that machines never beep without reason. The girls pressed closer to him, instinctively seeking protection. Their small shoulders brushed against his suit, and for a moment, Richard felt as though he were standing on a precipice. He could walk away and leave them to the system, two strangers who would see them as numbers and files. Or he could step forward into something terrifying, something binding, something he had sworn never to feel again. The door down the hall swung open, and a doctor stepped out, adjusting his glasses. Richard recognized the look on his face immediately. He had seen it before, on the day he lost his wife, on the day he buried his daughters. It was the expression of a man carrying news that no one wanted to hear. Richard rose, his height casting a long shadow across the twins. The doctor spotted him, then hesitated, as though weighing whether to speak here or in private. Richard's gaze hardened, the steel of command returning. "Tell me," he said quietly. The doctor glanced at the children, then back at Richard. "Not here," he murmured, motioning him aside. Richard hesitated. The girls clung to his sleeves, their small hands clutching fabric as though it were the only anchor they had. He pried their fingers loose gently. "I'll be right back," he promised. Lily's eyes filled with panic. "Don't leave us." The words tore at him, but he forced a reassuring smile. "I won't. I'll be right over there. I promise." He followed the doctor a few steps down the hall. The man's voice was low, clinical. Her condition has deteriorated significantly. We've done what we can. It's only a matter of time. Richard's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking back to the twins. The fragile children waiting for a miracle that would never come. How long? Richard asked. The doctor sighed. Hours, maybe, perhaps less. The words hit him like blows. Hours. That was all the time the girls had left with their mother. Hours before their world collapsed completely, Richard closed his eyes, fighting the surge of memory, his own daughter's final moments, the way he had stood helpless, unable to stop the tide of loss. He had promised himself he would never walk that corridor again. And yet, here he was, about to do it for two children who were not his own. He turned back toward Lily and Sophie. They were watching him, their small faces pale, their teddy bears clutched tight. Their eyes asked a question their voices dared not. Richard took a slow breath. He could walk away now, retreat into the empire he had built, hide behind steel and glass and money. But the weight in his chest told him that if he did, he would never escape this corridor. It would follow him into every boardroom, every penthouse, every carefully measured silence. For the first time in decades, Richard Morgan did not think about consequences or contracts. He thought only of two small girls and the promise he had made. He walked back to them, crouched low once more, and whispered, "I'm not going anywhere." And as the monitor beeped again behind the closed door, louder this time, sharper, the corridor seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the storm that was about to break. The beeping began softly, a tremor in the air that hardly registered at first. But then it quickened, sharp and insistent, slicing through the corridor like a blade. Richard's eyes flicked toward the closed door, every nerve in his body stiffening. He had heard that sound before too many times. It was never a good sound. Lily and Sophie clutched their teddy bears tighter. Sophie's small voice cracked through the silence. "That's Mommy's room." The words tore through him. The door slammed open, and a team of nurses rushed in, voices clipped, movements urgent. The shrill cry of alarms followed, merging with the rattling of machines inside. The sterile corridor that had been quiet just moments ago was suddenly alive with panic. The twins froze, wide-eyed. Then, as though pulled by an invisible thread, they lurched forward, small feet carrying them toward the door. Richard moved before he could think. His hands caught them gently, but firmly, pulling them back against his chest. "No," he said softly, though his voice trembled. "Not in there." But Lily began, her words breaking on a sob. Richard lowered himself to his knees, holding both girls against him as chaos swelled behind the door. He could feel their tiny hearts pounding through their dresses, could hear their ragged breaths as they tried to twist free. But he held on. "Listen to me," he whispered, forcing steadiness into his tone. "You don't want to see this. Trust me." The girls buried their faces against him, muffled sobs escaping into his suit. Richard's arms tightened around them, and for the first time in years, he felt the burn of tears pressing behind his own eyes. The sound of medical commands barked through the open doorway. Words he understood all too well. Flatline. Clear. Charged to 200. His stomach clenched. Memory threatened to swallow him. Another room. Another set of voices shouting those same words. Another moment where he had stood helpless while the world slipped through his fingers. The twins whimpered. Sophie whispered, "She's going to wake up, right?" "They'll help her wake up." Richard's throat constricted. He wanted to lie. He wanted to tell them yes, that their mother would walk out of that room and scoop them into her arms. But he couldn't. The truth sat heavy on his chest. He was a man who had built an empire on hard truths, and here, in this corridor, he could not speak a lie that would shatter them when the truth came crashing down. The alarms inside the room wailed higher. The nurse's voices grew louder. Then, a sudden silence, broken only by the steady monotone of a machine that did not stop. Richard closed his eyes. He didn't need to see it. He already knew. The doctor stepped out moments later, his face solemn, his hands pulling down the mask that hung loose now around his neck. His eyes found Richard first, then the children. He hesitated. Richard rose slowly, still holding Lily and Sophie's hands. His towering frame seemed to block the doctor's approach, a silent shield. He shook his head once, sharply. "Not now." Not in front of them. The doctor nodded faintly and retreated, leaving the corridor heavy with the unspoken. The girls tugged on Richard's sleeves, desperate. "What's happening? Why aren't they bringing her out? Why won't they let us see her?" Richard crouched again, his heart pounding. His voice cracked despite his efforts to steady it. Sweethearts. Sometimes the doctors try very hard, and he stopped. He couldn't finish. Not yet. Not like this. The twins' tears spilled faster, their cries growing raw, echoing down the corridor. For the first time in decades, Richard let his own tears fall too, silent but unstoppable. He pulled them against him, their small shoulders shaking as he wrapped them in his arms, sheltering them from a world that had just stolen everything they loved. The silence that followed was not empty. It was thick with grief, heavy with the sound of children's sobs and the ragged breath of a man who had once vowed never to cry again. Richard rocked them gently, something he hadn't done since his own daughters were small. He whispered words he barely remembered knowing, words meant to soothe, to comfort, though he wasn't sure they made sense. I've got you. I'm here. I won't let you be alone. The corridor stretched endlessly around them, indifferent to their grief. The lights hummed, the air smelled of disinfectant. The world outside kept moving, but inside that narrow strip of hospital floor, time seemed to stop. A billionaire CEO, a man who had once believed power could shield him from everything, now knelt broken with two children who had nothing left but him. And in that moment, Richard Morgan realized something terrifying. He had thought this would be the hardest moment, their mother's last breath, their innocence shattering. But it wasn't. The hardest moment was still to come, because once the sobs faded, once the truth was spoken aloud, he would face the question he could no longer avoid. What now? The hours that followed blurred into a haze of grief and stillness. The alarms had gone quiet, the door to Emily's room had been closed, and the sterile hospital corridor returned to its hushed monotony. But for Lily and Sophie, time had stopped. They huddled against Richard, small bodies trembling, their sobs echoing faintly in the emptiness. Richard had not moved. His back ached from the rigid floor, his suit wrinkled and stained with tears. But he stayed where he was. Every instinct that had once made him untouchable in business stoicism, control, detachment lay shattered around him. He held the girls until their tears subsided into hiccuping breaths, then into silence. The silence frightened him more than their sobbing. Sophie's tiny voice finally broke it, cracked and hoarse. She's not coming back, is she? Richard looked down at her. Lily's wide eyes mirrored the question, brimming with the kind of fear a child should never have to carry. He opened his mouth, but the words stuck. For years, he had trained himself never to speak without certainty, never to leave a sentence unfinished. Yet now, faced with two fragile hearts, every truth felt like a dagger. He swallowed hard, brushing a tear from Sophie's cheek with his thumb. No, sweetheart, she isn't. The words shattered them. Both girls cried again, quieter this time, broken sobs muffled against his chest. Richard tightened his arms around them, rocking gently, as if he could shield them from the truth he had just spoken. But grief was not the only shadow creeping into that corridor. It wasn't long before a woman appeared at the far end, heels clicking softly on the tile. She was dressed in muted gray, her dark hair pulled into a bun, and she carried a folder tucked under her arm. Her face wore the professional calm of someone used to dealing with broken families. Richard recognized her type instantly. A social worker, the woman approached, her expression gentle but businesslike. "Mr. Morgan?" she asked, her tone respectful but cautious. "I've been asked to speak with the children." Richard's jaw clenched. "Not now. I'm sorry," she said, lowering her voice. "But their mother's passing means immediate decisions must be made. The girls can't stay here overnight." She glanced at the twins, her eyes softening. "They'll need placement, at least temporarily." The word placement struck him like a slap. It made the girls sound like shipments, not human beings. Lily, overhearing, gripped his sleeve tightly. "We don't want to go, please." Her voice trembled with desperation. Sophie clung to her sister, tears spilling anew. Richard rose to his full height, his shadow stretching long across the corridor. "They're not going anywhere tonight," he said firmly. His voice, the same one that once silenced boardrooms, left no room for argument. The social worker hesitated. She was used to dealing with desperate families, not powerful men who radiated authority like a weapon. "Mr. Morgan, I understand your concern, but there are procedures. I'll take responsibility." Richard interrupted, his tone clipped. "They stay with me." The woman blinked. "Are you related to them?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Richard froze, his mind racing. No, he wasn't. Not by blood, not yet. But as Lily's hand clung tighter to his, and Sophie's tear-streaked face pressed into his side, he realized he was already bound to them by something stronger than paperwork. "They're not strangers to me," he said at last, his voice low, dangerous. "And they will not be handed to strangers tonight." The social worker studied him, clearly unsettled by the force in his words. Finally, she nodded slowly. "Very well. Temporary custody arrangements can be made, but I'll need documentation. Tomorrow, we'll discuss options." Their father. She hesitated, flipping through her folder. There are notes suggesting he may still be alive. The air seemed to thicken. Richard's eyes narrowed. "Alive? Yes," the woman said cautiously. "He left years ago, but we're required to contact him. He may have legal rights." Lily's small voice broke in, sharp with pain. "We don't have a father. He left. Mommy said so." The social worker gave them a pitying look, then turned back to Richard. "If he can be located, he'll be given a chance to reclaim custody." The words ignited something dark inside him. Richard's hands curled into fists. The thought of these children being thrown back into the arms of a man who had abandoned them filled him with a rage he hadn't felt in years. "They are not going back to a man who walked away," Richard growled, his voice quiet but lethal. "If you find him, you tell him this. He gave up the right the moment he left." The social worker shifted uncomfortably, clearly unused to such intensity. "That isn't my decision, Mr. Morgan. The law. I've dealt with laws my entire life." Richard cut in, his eyes blazing. "And I've been more than a few. These girls are not bargaining chips in a legal system. They've already lost enough." The twins clung tighter to him, their fragile bodies pressed into his side as though he were their last defense. In that moment, Richard realized he was. The social worker finally retreated, promising to return in the morning. Her heels clicked down the corridor until the sound faded into silence. Richard exhaled, long and heavy. His chest ached, his throat burned, and yet he felt something else beneath the grief and fury, something dangerous. Resolve. He looked down at Lily and Sophie, their tear-streaked faces turned up to him, their eyes silently begging the question they were too afraid to voice. "Don't worry," he said softly, bending to their level again. "I won't let anyone take you. Not him. Not anyone." The words weren't just comfort. They were a vow, but deep inside, Richard felt the chill of unease. Because if the father truly lived, if the law truly demanded he return, then this story was not over. Not by a long shot, and the next chapter would not be decided in a hospital corridor. It would be decided in battles far darker, where money, secrets, and bloodlines twisted into truths no one was ready to face. Asterisk. The night deepened over Dallas, wrapping the hospital in a heavy silence. Richard had not slept. He sat in the stiff chair by the corridor window, the twins curled against him, their small heads resting on his arms. Their breathing was uneven, broken by hiccups and soft whimpers that lingered from hours of crying. He held them tighter, unwilling to let go even for a moment. In the dim light, their faces seemed fragile as porcelain, pale and streaked with dried tears. They looked too small, too breakable, and yet within them burned a resilience that startled him. He had built skyscrapers, conquered markets, silenced adversaries, but these children, who had lost everything in a single night, carried more quiet strength than he had seen in anyone in years. He studied them, a storm raging inside his chest. He had made a promise. They would not go to strangers. He would not let them vanish into the system like forgotten case files. And he certainly would not allow the man who had abandoned them to swoop in now and reclaim what he had once discarded. But fate, as Richard well knew, had its own brutal timing. The next morning, the social worker returned. Her heels echoed down the corridor like a drumbeat of inevitability. She held a folder heavier than before, her face unreadable. Richard's stomach tightened as she approached. "I've located the father," she said quietly. The words dropped like stones into the silence. Lily stirred, her eyes blinking open, confusion clouding her gaze. Sophie shifted closer, clutching her bare dot. Richard rose slowly, careful not to wake them fully, and his voice was steel, though inside, a strange unease gnawed at him. The woman opened the folder, scanning the documents. "His name is Daniel Emerson. According to the records, he was married to Emily briefly before disappearing. There are no current addresses, but financial traces led to an old account, one that ties back to your own companies, Mr. Morgan." Richard froze. The air thickened, heavy as lead. "What did you say?" The social worker looked up, her eyes steady. "Daniel Emerson. You're a strange son-in-law. Emily was your daughter. The world tilted beneath him. For a heartbeat, Richard could not breathe. The twins' faces swam in his vision, their blonde hair, their blue eyes that mirrored a woman he had once held as a baby. A girl he had raised before pride and anger had torn them apart. Emily, his Emily, not his wife, not the love he had buried years ago. His daughter. He staggered back a step, one hand gripping the wall as though the corridor itself had betrayed him. Memory surged, merciless and sharp, a shouting match years ago, Emily slamming the door, her voice breaking as she swore she would never come back. He had let her go, too proud to chase her, and now she was gone forever, leaving behind the very pieces of herself that had found their way into his arms. By fate's cruel design, the twins, his granddaughters, the realization carved into him with brutal clarity. They weren't strangers. They weren't just orphans he had stumbled upon. They were his blood, his family. Richard's chest heaved. He looked down at Lily and Sophie, still half asleep, unaware of the storm that had just broken around them. Their small hands clutched his sleeve as though they had always belonged there. And perhaps they always had. The social worker's voice broke through, cautious. Legally, the father may still have rights. If Daniel is found, no, Richard snapped, his voice low but thunderous. The force of it silenced even the hum of the corridor. He left her. He left them. He would not have them now. The woman hesitated, but Richard stepped closer, his height and presence casting a shadow over her. Listen carefully. Those girls are mine, my granddaughters. If you try to take them from me, you will find every law, every court, every power in this city standing in your way. I built empires from nothing. I will burn them down before I let anyone harm these children again. The social worker swallowed hard, her composure cracking under the weight of his words. She closed the folder slowly, her hands trembling. Then you'd better prepare for a fight. Richard's eyes burned with a fire he hadn't felt in decades. I've been fighting my entire life. The woman retreated, leaving him alone with the girls. Richard sank back into the chair, pulling Lily and Sophie against him once more. His mind reeled with the revelation, but beneath the chaos, a strange sense of clarity settled. This was why he had found them. This was why he couldn't walk away. Fate had not broken its silence by chance. The twins stirred again, blinking up at him. What's wrong? Lily asked softly, her voice still heavy with sleep. Richard looked into their innocent eyes. The eyes of his daughter, the eyes of the family he thought he had lost forever. He smoothed their hair gently, his voice breaking as he whispered, "Nothing, sweethearts. Nothing at all. I've got you now." They nestled into him, trusting completely, unaware of the storm still looming over them. But Richard knew. He knew the battles ahead to fight for custody, the ghost of his estranged son-in-law, the scars of the past that would not heal easily, yet for the first time in decades. Richard Morgan felt something stronger than grief, stronger than ambition. He felt purpose. And as dawn's first light filtered through the hospital window, painting the corridor in fragile gold, he made a vow as unshakable as steel. No matter what it cost him money, power, even the empire he had built, he would not fail them. Not these girls, not his blood. The millionaire CEO had conquered markets, crushed rivals, and built towers that touched the sky. But now, he faced the greatest battle of his life, not to build an empire, but to save the little girls who had cried in a hospital corridor, unseen by the world. Until he found them, and this time, he would not lose.